Yeah, so I'm a little bit different perspective. I'm coming from the private sector in the US and from a global standpoint. I help companies track and reduce their carbon footprint, and then take that information, apply the 17 Sustainable Development Goals into their various policies so that they could become more socially responsible.
Okay, thank you. This is another level from our discussing how the private, public, civil society all together to embed in these times that we are living, and I'm exciting because it's interesting this connection with these goals from sustainability. How does it work with the companies? Also with connect with the police. But Amanda, I have your presentation here.
Yes,
you can start.
Yeah, so as Brian was saying earlier, we were taking it from looking at a federal level, and globally, mostly what you see is the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. But we're doing a lot of things at the state and local level with the communities, the businesses, and the governments. And so we wanted to take a time to show you a little bit more about those tactics of what we are actually doing and how we are still really in the Paris Agreement. You just may not see it at the federal administration at this time. So I'm going to show you a little bit about our state level, which is the Climate Alliance, and then a little bit deeper into our city level, which is our climate agreement with our mayors, and then what we are doing from a business perspective. So if you could flip to the next slide for me, Rue. So the Climate Alliance is comprised of 25 bipartisan states. So overall, the United States has 50, and we have 25 states that have joined this coalition as a bipartisan effort, and their commitment is to continue on with the Paris Agreement. Their principles are to lead on climate action because they realize that it is a true threat to our environments, to our communities, and to our economy. They are looking at how can we make state level actions to benefit our communities and our economies, and then also demonstrate how it actually can be done. So showing not only our nation, but also the globe that we are taking action, we do take it seriously. And we have not withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. We are taking those targets and making them happen, as Brian had stated earlier, with the 27% reduction in emissions. So how are they doing that? They're looking at about 7 different private sector priority sectors, and one is the climate resilience. So how are we going to take technical tools to identify where sea level is rising, where the different weather patterns are occurring, and how can we change and make and adapt to those issues? Looking at clean energy finance. What clean energy investments can we take? What way can we look at insurance? Because we know that has been an impact to us, looking at risk and changing and mitigating those approaches. And then delivering financial tools at an equitable and just process, including through green banks. Looking at our power sector and modernization. So bringing regulatory tools, kind of bringing that government interference to lay down the line, to share best practices, expand and strengthen our carbon markets. Product energy efficiency standards, not only from the business side, but also what's going on in the residential side, from appliances to equipment, and how we can better engineer buildings. Advanced transportation. Right now, this group of 25 states represent 1/3 of light duty vehicles that have been transferred over to zero emissions, as well as 2/3 electric vehicle sales have driven down zero emissions. And they continue to put in near-term targets to the 2030 mark to drive that transition further. Also looking at natural and working lands. This is carbon sequestration, land restoration, conservation, management policies, as well as carbon storage. And what practices can we do from farmland to wetlands? We have really degraded our soil in the United States. So we're looking at policies to improve that, to take it from dirt back to soil. And lastly, short-lived chemical pollutants. We're well aware of the issues that we have going on in our public health sector with, as Brian had mentioned earlier, asthma issues because of the pollutants. We are 4% of the global population, yet we are the second largest emitter in the world. And so not only do we have to look at our CO2 emissions, our methane emissions, we also have to look at what other chemicals are we putting into the air. And we have some near-term opportunities to remove them from the market, and our governors are looking at putting state policies into place to take those out of the businesses. So if you could slide on to the next slide. So what does this group represent? It represents 55% of our national population. That is the third largest economy in the world, next to US and China. And they represent $11.7 trillion into the economy, as well as 1.7 million clean jobs has come out of this transition so far since they've stepped up to this agreement. And since the last 12 years, we've had a 16% in reduction in greenhouse gases in these states, and the US average is only 7. So for a per capita output, it's increased about 12% as compared to the US at 4%. So a couple of case studies here on the left-hand side that I wanted to show you of some results that we've driven at the state level. California taken a very aggressive approach a couple years ago. They have now come down to emissions lower than 1990s level, and that has been through a cap and trade program and several other influential policies that they've put in place. Illinois, they passed a wind development legislation that started an offshore wind committee, and the way that they've been able to be successful in that program is getting citizens involved. And so with that, they are on target to meet a 28% reduction by 2025. And then we have one for North Carolina, where they are our second largest installation of solar capacity, creating several green jobs as people transition away from coal and fossil fuel and move over to renewable energy sources. So some of the success driven out of this is these governors are engaging internationally. They're regionally combining coalitions. They're strengthening policies through learning from other states and implementing climate targets and tracking and reporting. So putting a little more governance, accountability, and measurements around some of the policies they're implementing. If you could change to slide 3, please. So that was kind of our state level. Now I want to drill it down a little more to our city level. So we have 10,000 cities, a little bit more than that, in the United States. And the cities and communities, as well as the states, are taking action at a local level. The first one I want to bring to your attention is the Global Covenant of Mayors of Climate Change and Energy. That compromises of 173 US cities, and they are just solely focusing on CO2 emissions. So how can they change the public transportation systems? How can they get more biking systems? How do they look at how people commute into and out of the cities? And doing that through financial models that are available to all and making it a just and accessible process. Inclusive of that group, this is more of a global stand. They're involved in the C40, which is a global level with 138 countries, which represents about 958 million citizens. And then the Alliance for Sustainable Development is some nonprofit organizations aligned with our mayor's annual conference, and it represents about 180 mayors. But just of those 10,000 plus cities, I want to point out that 10 cities are above 1 million in the population, and about a little less, the rest of them are less than 100,000. So what is the Alliance looking at? They're looking at, they've implemented a transition for 94% emissions of bus transit, 90% in bike lanes, 85% in commuting, and 76% of greenhouse gas tracking. So they've been able to make those transitions in the last 12 years as well. And then lastly, when we started to make the transition with the Paris Agreement, the climate mayors came together and started working with legislation with our Congress and our Senate as a bipartisan alignment, pushing legislation to take action at a national level and to do it congruently. So this group represents about 75 million citizens in 468 cities. They work more on inventory of municipal action and kind of putting that together collectively with specific targets, specific significant actions, and then sharing those amongst the other cities to make sure that it is a just and green, equitable recovery. And their biggest focus right now is how do we do that post-COVID? If you can move on to the next slide for me. So governments can't go about this alone. The business sector needs to be aligned with this because they're the ones producing most of that CO2 emission. And it takes a collaborative approach from citizens, from businesses, from universities, and from other groups in the community to make that happen. So when we as a nation withdrew from the Paris Agreement, businesses turned around and took action. They created an alliance, and it's called the We Are Still In. And you can see there, if you go to the We Are Still In platform, it is an open platform to show transparency of what businesses are involved, what they're doing within their businesses, and how they're influencing and working with others to make the changes. It represents about 155 million workers, a $9 trillion economy, and to date, they've taken 993 climate contributions to make change within the community and through national levels. They're building technologies and they're transitioning away from fossil fuels. And the governance behind them, you probably have seen them in some other conferences, is SARES, the WWF, and Climate Nexus. And then another one that I think is very important to recognize, because this is the Carbon Capture Coalition. It is, again, a bipartisan solutions. It's made up of about 80 businesses. It is the ones that are highly contributing to our CO2 emissions in the United States, and they're helping influence federal policy on a carbon capture, carbon transport, carbon use, carbon removal, and carbon storage. And it is inclusive of industry, energy, technology, labor unions, conservation, and policy organizations. So a lot of people's argument in the United States comes down to, well, what about the jobs? What again about the jobs? And this group is coming together and saying, well, their skills are there, the competencies are there, and they're transferable. And we have the jobs in the renewable sector to make sure that everyone has an equitable way of life. So they're doing consensus policy blueprinting away from coal and fossil fuel. So if you can move to the next slide. So how are we getting all of this done? It takes market forces to make things happen. So BlackRock is one of our influential investment management companies, announced a few years ago that businesses will be evaluated. The CEO will be evaluated on how well they are managing their ESG, their environmental, social, and governance of their business, and really drilling that down to the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. And so with that, businesses are aligning with the United Nations and taking on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They're getting green certifications, which are influenced by governmental policies. And there's also the self-reporting, which is through the B Corp certification. And consumers are holding them accountable to that. Our consumers, our people, our citizens, our communities, we want the climate action to happen. So we're demanding the quality of green certifications as well as the SDGs. As you can see here, the businesses are also being held accountable. This is an example of Salesforce. They have to put this in their annual reports of what are they doing to be more socially, environmentally responsible. So when our systems fail us, a groundswell pursues. And internationally, people may think we have pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but we did not. We are still taking action in our communities, in our industries, our local governments, and we're pushing policy upward. So thank you, Rue.
Thank you, Amanda. This was